We're going to talk about getting gigawatts on the grid. And so I'm going to invite my friend Brian George to join us first, to come up to the stage. Brian is the Global Energy Market Development and Policy U.S. Federal Lead for Google. That is a very long title, and it probably fits on one business card, but a very long one. Next to Brian, I'm going to ask Aftab Khan, who is the Executive Vice President of Operations, Planning and Security at PJM Interconnection, to join us on the stage. After Aftab, Deborah Phillips, she's the President and CEO of the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, and she has some great data points that I didn't know until she brought me up to speed. You're going to want to hear from Deborah. After that is Matt Picardi, who is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Shell Energy North America. And last but not least on our panel is Dana Saucier, Vice President and Head of Economic Development at Jobs Ohio. And our moderator for today is Daniel Moore, who you may remember was formerly at another publication. He is now at Axios, where he covers things on the Hill, but still remains very invested in the energy space. And so, Daniel, with that, I'm going to get out of your way and turn it over to you.
All right. Well,
however you want to do.
I'm going to keep this just in case I'm knocked off my feet by the conversation here. Thanks to EPSA for having me moderate this panel. This is growing demand for electricity has been something that's been one of the top policy issues that I've covered at Axios, if not the top policy issue permeating everything today. So I'm really excited to have 5 people who are approaching this from different perspectives. And I want to start off by kind of setting the stage and talking about the context for just how fast we've seen this load growth arrive. And Aftab, I wanted to start with you. If you could, first of all, kind of just introduce yourself and talk about your role at PJM, and give us a sense of just what you've experienced over the last 2-3 years at PJM, and how fast has this hit your territory.
Yeah, I mean, great. I think I'll probably emphasize a couple things that have been brought up already today a few times. But first of all, in my role at PJM, I run our operations. So we have a 24/7 control room that sometimes gets forgotten, but these are the folks that are in real time just managing that generation dispatch and transmission, making the system work every day. I have responsibility for all of our transmission planning efforts. That includes regional planning, all the interconnection planning, load forecasting, longer-term load forecasting, and then I also have responsibility for our security functions, cybersecurity, physical security. But in terms of, and again, you've heard a lot today, but in terms of load and its impact in what we do, because again, to summarize, I think people know PJM, but we run wholesale energy markets, capacity and energy. We plan the regional transmission system. And as I said, we operate the system daily, 24/7 real time. So in terms of, kind of what we've been seeing, it all actually begins with our load forecast process, right? Because load forecasting is what tells us what we need to do in markets and transmission planning, even how we need to prep our operations room to kind of manage a future. And I'll just use, starting out, the load, and we publish a load forecast annually, but I use the January 25 load forecast that we published a few years ago, and I'm going to use 2030. We do it for like a 20-year load forecast, but I'm just going to focus on 2030. I know Manu in the previous panel also mentioned that. So if I take our 25, so this year, we're projecting to have a peak load in PJM of 154 gigawatts. I know Manu talked about last year, which was 152. And then by 2030, according just to the load forecast in January, we're 184 gigawatts. So again, that's a 30 gigawatts, or roughly 20% increase in our load in 5 years. And keep in mind, for the last 10 years in PJM, we've been relatively flat, peak load at around 150 gigawatts. So to talk about in 5 years, being flat and then going to having a 30 gigawatt load increase, that has huge implications on us in, like as I said, on our markets and how we operate the system, how we plan our regional transmission planning goes out minimum 5 years and out. We'll start seeing impacts there on what kind of transmission we need. But I would say all things, and you heard it multiple times today, somehow lead back to resource adequacy, right? Because we could build all the transmission we want, but if we don't have the resources on the system to serve that load, that's our issue. So Manu highlighted, our concerns about resources retiring, how do we accelerate the entry of new resources, ultimately how do we forecast this load and get a better certainty on it to be able to try to address the resource adequacy issue. So I think on a high level, that's how I would summarize it. It's a load forecast that drives everything that we do at PJM.
Great, and I'll come back to you and we'll talk a little bit about what PJM's doing to get more resources connected to the grid. Brian, I want to go to you next and talk a little bit about how Google has seen the landscape over the last couple of years and why energy is so important to Google's mission and how you've gone about trying to get more power connected to the grid.
Yeah, so first off, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great to see so many of you. I think when I started in my current role about 3 years ago, I would used to have to start panels with a little bit of an exercise, and I'd have people raise their hands if they'd checked their email or looked up a map or done something since the panel started. And by the end of the question, everyone in the room had their hand up, and the point of doing that was to show that every time someone does that, you're relying on some piece of physical infrastructure, right? The cloud does not live in the sky. The cloud lives in buildings, and it's connected with wires to everything we do. And so I've found that I don't have to do that anymore. It seems like people have very clearly made the linkage between the services that we provide that everyone in this room demands, right, and the energy piece. And so I would say maybe 12 months, 14 months into the job, we started noticing, this real uptick. And I think we probably had about a 6-month lead time on everyone else. And I think there was a real recognition that we do have to change how we're going to market, right? Because historically, it's fair to say that big C&I customers that have come onto the grid, including data centers over the past 15, 20 years, have really benefited from a legacy system, right? We've largely been able to interconnect and take advantage of headroom on the system that's efficient, right? We've extracted more out of the system, but what it means from a business perspective, right, is that we never really had to think about the risk of not getting access to the system. That's not the same anymore, right? We're facing delays, we're facing queues, we're facing no, right? That's not an answer we're used to getting from our utility partners. And so I think it's forced us as a company to really think about how do we change that go-to-market strategy. And I think the fundamental piece there is that the infrastructure that our investments are triggering, whether it's generation or whether it's transmission or distribution, those have real costs, right? And the folks that are investing in those assets, that's a lot of risk. And as large customers coming onto the system, we've recognized that we actually have to accept a little bit more of that risk than we have in the past, right? We have to put a little bit of skin in the game when we're showing up to provide some certainty to the grid operators, to the generators, to the utilities, that we are actually going to be there. And so, Aftab mentioned the load forecast. That's critically important, right? As we're going forward, we have to have certainty in what's going into that forecast. We have to have confidence in the signals that it's sending, right, to mitigate some of this broader uncertainty. There is a lot of noise in the market right now. And so I think it's on us, in partnership with PJM, with the other ISOs, with everyone in the ecosystem, to get as much clarity, right, in that noise as we can. We're never going to get 100% right, but we have to be as confident as we can be given the dollars that we're talking about. So look forward to the conversation today, and thank you again for the invitation.
Right, and I guess before we go much further, going back to off-top, talking about load forecasting, there's a lot of estimates out there. I know I've written a lot of stories about what's coming and where exactly it's going to be. I mean, how is that a challenge? How big of a challenge is that for PJM to accurately predict where this is coming and what's real versus what may be more speculative?
Yeah, I mean, in general, right, like any forecast is going to have uncertainty, right? And I think what makes some of this data center load forecasting a little bit more, I would just call it unknown at this stage, is it's a relatively recent phenomena. I mean, it really wasn't, so I mentioned our load forecast happens annually. So it was really our January 24 load forecast where I think we first saw the bump up in our load for 2030, right? So again, I mentioned 184 gigawatts in 2030 is our forecast. Well, it was 168 gigawatts when we did the load forecast in 2024. So just in 1 year, we added 16 gigawatts to the 2030 load forecast. And like I said, this just happened between 2 load forecast periods. So it's happened fast. I think it's also been mentioned earlier today. So it's it's happening fast. And so just by nature of that, you could start to say there could be some opportunity for improvement in how we better understand this load forecast. But you know what I would say, we're definitely working on that, and we're talking to we ultimately receive those large load information from our transmission owner zones in PJM. So they're the ones who we don't talk directly to data center loads. I mean, we talk to the hyperscalers just on a higher level, but the actual interconnection requests happen because that's where the jurisdiction is. It's with the state and local utilities, which then roll up through our transmission owner zones to us. So we don't have that direct contact, but we are working with those transmission owners to come up with some more consistent rules and guidelines on information that we need to incorporate their information into our forecast. So as we do that process this year, we've made some improvements, I believe, to the quality of information that we're going to get. But the thing I would say, I mean, we're going to improve load forecasting. The reality is the load is coming. Load's very significant to what we've seen probably in the last several decades. And so while we'll continue to fine tune, I think we're convinced there's very significant load growth coming our way, and we're going to have to prepare for that.
Yeah, there's little question about the fact that we're seeing load growth coming. And to zoom in a little bit, Dana, I'd love to go to you and hear your experience in Ohio. I'm originally from the Columbus area, and every time I was just home last weekend and drove by some data centers. And it's been amazing to see over the last 10 or 15 years just the development across the board in central Ohio and across the state. So can you talk a little bit about what Ohio is doing and how you're thinking about incentivizing new big customers onto the grid while also balancing community concerns and customer concerns?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, EPSA, for including us. Maybe just to step back a little bit about what or who Jobs Ohio is because it's a very unique organization. We're a private organization that is spearheading job creation statewide in 10 specific industry verticals. So we focus on the industries that amount to about 38% of the gross state product. So think advanced manufacturing, energy and chemicals, tech, banking, insurance, bio, pharma. And we engage and meet with about 3,000 companies a year. We close between 250 and 400 deals a year, so almost about 1.5 deals per day. And these are companies that are either already in Ohio that are expanding or new companies that we're attracting to the state. And we do scour the globe. We're playing a big role in reindustrialization back from not just the coast of the U.S., but abroad as well. A lot of the jobs that went offshore were funded by the state liquor monopoly. We run that business. It's about $1.7 billion business, and then we harvest about $350 million a year. And my job is basically all the commercial activity. I spent 25 years prior to that in energy, so this topic is pretty near and dear. So with that being said, we are working, and I know a lot of focus on the data centers, but one of the things I would say is coming out of COVID, it's been quite astonishing what's going on in Ohio. We would court maybe 2 or 3 companies a year of the 200-300 that might have a load bigger than 100 megawatts. And now we have times where our pipeline has 25, and some are in excess of 500 megawatts, and even a few beyond 1,000. Obviously, they don't start there, but they grow to that over time. And that's not counting the data centers. So in addition to that, and and Ohio was one of the states of a handful that created a data center tax credit, which I think a lot of people don't realize that data centers, they build the shells, but everything in it refreshes every 2, 3, 4 years. So our tax codes would tax that. In the old days, it's not like a auto manufacturer puts it in and stays there for 30, 40 years. So we wanted to align so that we would be open to kind of grabbing the tech economy. We make impact investments, so we help customers find sites. We will make investments, plant and equipment. We also do loans and different grants. We also facilitate with state government and also local government. So think of us as a concierge to the state, and we de-risk it. There's no cost to our companies. One thing I think in addition to all that makes us unique is of our 10 industry verticals, we've plucked a team of people that typically have at least 20 years of walking in those industry shoes. So aerospace, think all these things. So we try to see things from the customer point of view. And now maybe pivoting back to energy, obviously we have an energy and chemical sector, so we're very focused on attracting power generators, pipelines, gathering systems, oil and gas drilling companies, solar and wind, nuclear and the like. We recognize that that's an important sector, job creator, but it's also incredibly strategic across all of our other sectors. As we like to say, find a prosperous economy that doesn't have good energy, resilience and competitive pricing and reliability. It just doesn't exist. It comes hand in hand. So in a nutshell, that's the future's bright. We've ranked number 2, I think it's working, number 2 in mega projects announced for the last 3 years in a row, and that's against places like Texas and Florida. We're ranking number 1 or 2 in reshoring of companies back to the U.S. and even nearshoring domestically. And then we were back in 2009, not doing very well, but now we're ranked as number 2 lowest cost of living. And then CEOs rank us in the top 5 or 6 as best places to do business. And so, the old Rust Belt we think is over, and we're excited about the future.
Sounds like I need to go back to Ohio, it's like right when I left, it started getting better. Matt, I want to go to you next and talk a little bit about your company's perspective on all of this, and in particular how you've seen the energy market shift in response to this demand, and just this idea of having competitive markets, open markets, and regulatory certainty and all of that, and just talk a little bit about how you've seen this shift over the last couple of years.
Sure, and thanks to the folks at EPSA for inviting me here. And I am the Matt Picardi that Rich Dewey referred to, that's part of the Niagara Mohawk Alumni Mafia. Let me start, maybe a good place to start is a little bit about what we do, in case people don't know, and how maybe we've shifted over the last 5 or 6 years as a result of a lot of the change we've seen, not only in the markets, but obviously in the priorities and the demand issues we're facing. So I'll probably go right before, generally, I'm part of Niagara Mohawk Energy, which we are the marketing and trading arm of Shell for power, gas, renewable products. We're present in every market in the country, very active in ERCOT, both as a supplier, a counterparty for transactions, hedges, as well as developing some power plants. We're active in California. We're active in the West, involved with all the market design issues going there, and we're active in the eastern markets, both as a supplier to competitive retail suppliers, to serving in default service auctions, to recently acquiring the RISE facility in New England, natural gas-fired generating facility, as part of our recent strategy to start investing in FlexGen or dispatchable generation, obviously a direction we think things are going. And got a lot of fine folks, some of them here, and my colleagues are here, that help cover the U.S. and all the different markets that we're in. From our perspective, pre-COVID, I mean, Shell was investing in offshore wind, still invested some. We acquired Savion, a solar and battery renewables developer. And we were heavily involved in all the markets, being counterparties to a lot of folks, including folks in this room, providing hedges, 5, 10, 20-year hedges, not as far out anymore, which will be part of my discussion. But, saw a huge shift at that point in terms of where the world was heading with costs. Regulatory certainty was becoming an issue, and our portfolio and direction kind of changed a little bit, but I think we're still, for the most part, trying to do all the above and continue to be involved in all the markets. What I would say most importantly, though, on the market certainty is we are heavily involved in what I call the secondary market. So we talk a lot about, and you heard the presentations earlier talking about the ISO platforms and what they are doing to improve the capacity market, and talk a little bit about energy and a little bit about ancillary services. We have a holistic view. We're looking at the entire market, not only in terms of where revenue streams come when we're offering to provide hedges to counterparties, but also when we might invest in resources. So we developed a thing with, that we've been talking about called a revenue stack, and we talked about it in several proceedings. And what that does is it says, what revenue streams from these markets do generation technologies rely on, which are the revenue streams, and what markets exist around them in order to provide hedges so that they can get financing to come onto the system. Because we heard earlier, a lot of projects are starting to not go forward that have gotten through the queue, and part of the reason is lack of financing. Part of that could be it's been harder for companies like ours to identify adequate long-term markets to help them hedge. So we looked at, for example, a combined cycle plant, and it turned out that that probably relies more on a capacity market these days for revenues than, let's say, a solar project or battery. So what we feel the discussion has to be more about is understanding the revenue streams different technologies rely on, and how the secondary markets where some of this hedging activity occurs to help bring them online and get financing, how that's impacted by it. Now, that's not the only source of revenues, but it's certainly, over the years, it's been the transactions we've been able to do with customers going 5+ years out, mostly around energy, has helped bring a lot of resources on the line, and I'm certain we'd like to continue to do that.
Great. Well, underpinning everything, of course, is the actual components that make up the power grid. And so, Deborah, I'd love to hear how your companies, how your members are responding to this challenge. I know you've formed some alliances with other trade associations. You're working on a grid report that's dropping imminently, as I understand it. So can you talk a little bit about how your members have responded to this and what comes next?
Sure. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you all here today. I represent the electrical equipment manufacturers, NEMA. We're a trade association based here in DC. We do a lot of policy advocacy. We set standards. You're probably familiar with that work. And we do a lot of business intelligence and forecasting. Our members serve all aspects of the electrical system. So from lighting, wiring cable, motors and drives, transformers, distributed electrical resources, technology. So all of that is encompassed within the NEMA membership. We serve grid applications, so companies that you know well in that space: Hitachi, Mitsubishi, GE Prolec, and of course there's been a lot going on in the grid space, and we're front and center in some of those challenges. Transformer technology is covered by NEMA, so we've been very active there, both on the incentive side, but also alleviating some of those bottlenecks. We also serve buildings, so residential applications, commercial applications, healthcare applications, e-mobility, EV charging infrastructure, GM Energy, Tesla, part of the electrical ecosystem and part of this organization, and also industrial applications. So was previously mentioned, the amount of onshoring that's happening in manufacturing that's driving a ton of demand for industrial applications of electrical technologies. So the manufacturers of these technologies have a unique vantage point. We're seeing this increased demand in materials kind of across the board. And so you mentioned we're releasing a study from our vantage point that projects out to 2050 what we see in terms of electrical demand, given that unique vantage point serving all of these end-use markets. And so, we can talk about it in a little bit more detail. We're doing an advanced press briefing on Friday. The full report will be released on Monday. But our projection is 55% demand growth between now and 2050, about 2% a year, which is somewhere, I would say, middle of the road between what you've seen from organizations like McKinsey versus EIA. So we're sort of coming out somewhere in the middle. The vast majority of that demand over the next 10 years is from the data center AI space, as you can imagine. After that, we still see a lot of growth in industrial and e-mobility. Of course, there's a lot of that investment happening over the last two or 3 years in EV charging infrastructure. Some of that activity is cooled, but we still see longer term that it's going to be a huge area of electricity growth. And so, we can get into not only are we making those projections about where we see demand going, but also what's the solution set in terms of technologies and in terms of policies that can help us meet those demands. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more here in a minute.
Definitely. And I want to throw out a question to all of you about affordability. That's been a concern I've seen over and over again about, on one level, just building out the grid and building new projects, it costs money, how that's going to affect ratepayers' bills every month. And there's a concern about just like how the building of data centers will affect, the average residential customer in some areas. I think I read a story recently out of Oregon talking about this issue, and there's a lot of people concerned about what that's going to do to their utility bill. And so I'm curious how you all have been talking. Maybe Brian, we can start with you on that one. Just like, how have you been talking to people at the community level about data centers moving in, and are there kind of innovative approaches at the state level to address rate concerns?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for the easy question. So, I think, this is something we're dealing with in real time. Back to the opening comments I made, in many cases, we are driving the need for investment in significant new infrastructure on the system. And in the most cases, these are shared system assets, right? Transmission, distribution, generation infrastructure. And so I think, we have historically, as an industry and as a company, always been willing to sort of pay our fair share for the costs that we're adding to the system. I think now, this is where the rubber meets the road, right? We're seeing in many places, the costs of that infrastructure show up in real time. And so I'm happy with a lot of the work we've done at the state level, in particular, a recent settlement we achieved in Indiana with Indiana Michigan Power, that really, in our view, kind of set the framework for how we think this should look going forward. And so I'm happy to share details offline about that, but a couple big things, right? It required new large loads to the system to post collateral much more significantly than we have in the past. It also required new large loads to accept significant minimum demand provisions over the term of a contract with a retail supplier, to the tune, I believe, of 12 years at 80%. And so that's signing up, that's effectively take or pay, right? And so that, again, that shifts some of the risk back onto us. We're not shifting that entirely on ratepayers, but I do think, we're going to see in real time discussions around cost allocation and what's the right way to make sure we're appropriately balancing cost allocation at the retail level. And, I think we're approaching a point where we may see new approaches, right, that we haven't dealt with before. So, I think it's all part of where we are today. I would also say I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the benefits that competitive wholesale markets can provide in mitigating the costs that are ultimately shared across ratepayers. We have been tremendously successful in our approach with power purchase agreements with developers across the country. We have seen, and this probably won't shock most folks, we have seen an ability to be a little bit more innovative in the regions where we have restructured markets. But we have assets everywhere, right? And we have load in vertically integrated regions as well as competitive markets. And so I think we are approaching a point where we're going to have some real conversations about what is the right way to lower the overall cost of the assets we're talking about, right? Not just how we're allocating those costs. And I do think things like competitive wholesale markets are a good way to make sure we're bringing down that total overall cost.
Gotcha. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Happy to jump in. Yes, and so, I mean, from our perspective, obviously, these folks are customers. Work with them, serve them, behind the meter, in front of the meter. We've been looking at different ways to do it and what fits best with our skill sets and our resources and our expertise. And I think that on a competitive basis, we think the wholesale markets are the best place to go because some of that risk can stay with companies like ours where we've assumed it in the past. One of the things we've talked about a lot is if one of the loads, which Brian, obviously, they've recognized that issue, and it's great to hear they're coming to the table recognizing the cost impacts that these large loads could have. I always use the example, which was when we were in Virginia talking about these issues. Imagine that all of a sudden the city of Richmond just showed up. But then imagine 10 years later, if DeepSeek 2 comes along, it went away. What would happen to those costs? And so if they're doing it in a competitive market with counterparties that are not regulated and have to take the risk of that investment, then ratepayers aren't impacted. They're insulated from that long-term risk. And so I think that's what a lot of folks in this room want to do, be part of that, helping data centers participate in the market fairly and protect consumers against issues like that. In terms of the transmission side, I mean, those are a little bit stickier, more detailed questions because it depends on how you're integrated with the system. And a lot of what we heard today I thought was very good in terms of we should be looking at all options, not just, settling on one particular approach where it's got to be co-located or it's got to be done this way on the other side of the meter. I think there could be a variety of ways of interconnecting these loads, and I know we've looked at different ways of doing it, and it depends on the circumstances of the customer. Are they willing to engage in a demand response? Is there property they need? Is there water? It is kind of a bespoke process in many ways, and so it takes a lot of different skill sets.
And so I want to talk about solutions. I want to talk about what's going on to get more power connected to the grid. And so in PJM, I know there's the Reliability Resource Initiative that just launched, and I believe you've attracted 94 applications so far. Can you give us all an update on how that's going? Do you think that so far that's meeting PJM's goal, and what kind of comes next?
Yeah, so maybe let me start a little bit with an overview of just the whole PJM interconnection queue, because I know interconnection queues across the country have gotten huge amounts of attention, I think rightly so. And I think it was, again, mentioned earlier today, it was really the volume of clean energy, largely wind and solar projects with batteries as well, that just came in at high volume across the country, and PJM was no different, and it overwhelmed our interconnection queue. So we went through the reform process, working with our stakeholders, got FERC approval. And so just to share some numbers, it was really in December 2023 where we snapped the line with our new reform process, which was really to go away from that first come, first served serial approach to a cluster-based approach. And by the way, we started that before FERC Order 2023 because our reform process, I think, largely aligns with Order 23 in terms of being a cluster-based approach. So December 2023, snapped the line. Let's say there was 170 gigawatts of backlog resources that we had to work through. March 2025, that number is 66 gigawatts now. So we've brought our backlog down by 60% in about 15 months, right? So we're still obviously got to clean up the rest of it, but we've made tremendous progress, and it will be early next year where we will begin a new cycle where all resources, any new resources can now submit into the interconnection queue. So we're getting close to actually starting new projects coming in. But we did realize that for all the reasons, again, discussed extensively today, we have a near-term resource adequacy concern and we need to do something urgently. So part of the transition process that we have, there's in our cycle process, transition cycle 2, which is starting up now, which is again part of this cleaning up backlog. And we said, hey, it would be great if we could get the right quality resources into this cycle to just accelerate the entry of new resources. And that's where this Reliability Resource Initiative came in, RRI. And we're grateful for FERC support and approval of the proposal. And what RRI is we are limiting it to 50 projects. So we got 94 applications. We're only going to accept 50. And the reason we did that is we wanted to make sure we minimize any adverse impact to the transition cycle. We need transition cycle 2. We're focused on cleaning up the backlog. So we wanted to minimize impact, so we limited it to 50. And we put some stricter requirements. So resources in RRI, first of all, they have to commit to participate in the capacity market for 10 years. We also set a requirement that in a normal interconnection, an interconnecting generator can delay their milestone for a year for any reason. We remove that. So any resource in RRI has to keep their milestone commitments if they're accepted. And then we're using a weighting criteria. So we got 94 and we can only take 50. So we have a weighting criteria that takes the magnitude of the resource, which is megawatts in unforced capacity, UCAP, takes the ELCC, effective load carrying capability, so the reliability contribution of resource, the locational, like is it in an area where we have capacity scarcity? We'll evaluate points there. And obviously in service date, we need resources as soon as possible, so there's weighting according to in-service date. So we're going to go through that. We're in that process right now. We should wrap that up in a couple weeks because we're going to begin at the end of the month transition cycle 2, and these RRI resources need to be part of that. And then also mentioned earlier today is changes we made to surplus interconnection. So if you have a 100 megawatt, just use an example, solar facility that's only outputting obviously when the sun's shining, but rest of the hours of the day you have capacity you could use. We've relaxed rules, and again, grateful for FERC support there, to change our surplus interconnection rules so that other resources could site at that same location, use that same point of interconnection, and just improve the quality of the resources used at that point of interconnection. So I think a number of things that we're really trying to do between Q reform, RRI, surplus interconnection, just do everything we can to reasonably accelerate the entry of new resources into PJM.
And PJM is framed RRI as being this kind of extraordinary one-time initiative, right? I mean, do you see, while you work on the generator interconnection queue, so you see PJM's work in focusing on the interconnection queue as being kind of the long-term solution there, and that you wouldn't think RRI would need to have another phase or anything like that down the road,
No.
as we sit here today? Anyway.
Yeah, no, as I sit here today, we're really, we're pretty confident in the reformed queue process. And as I said, we will start the normal cycle process early next year. So RRI was, in our view, a one-time, just accelerate resources that are ready to go now and just try to run them through as part of transition cycle 2.
Gotcha. And this kind of gets at something I've written about in DC a lot, which is the idea of fast-tracking certain types of generation in the interconnection queue. There's been some legislation in Congress introduced to that effect. FERC Chairman Mark Christie has talked about prioritizing dispatchable power generation in the interconnection queue. And I guess I'm wondering, is that, and this is a complicated conversation that often gets politicized on kind of what types of power do we need to connect to the grid. But I'm wondering, Aftab or others, I mean, kind of what you think about, like, what is dispatchable? What, is that a good idea, bad idea, neutral idea? Like, is that helpful to have that kind of authority permanently to kind of pick certain power attributes and fast track it? What do you think about that? Yeah.
Projects. When we look at the projects that we're landing, they're largely base load. They need power around the clock. And we often survey, why did you choose Ohio or why didn't you? And speed, risk, money is, you can put almost any concern they have into one of those three categories. And they want, they want reliability that, most companies are not going to forego that. They want competitiveness. And then they want to be able to grow and operate the way they are on the site that they are. But then there are some industries that want renewables and want other attributes, carbon capture and other things. So we try to accommodate, but I would say the most, at least for the ones we deal with, that resiliency, competitive pricing is absolutely paramount, particularly if we're reshoring them they left the United States because of costs, maybe decades ago, are coming back. So all of that is super important. So from what we see, that is paramount. And again, we do have some industries doing a lot of a lot of solar in Ohio. So I assume they're making extra efforts in that area. But the competitive economy we have, it's really what's king is reliability and price.
Yeah, and maybe if I could jump in, I mean, I think at least from our perspective, I mean, the reliability, like we still demand 5 nines reliability, right? And it's really, really hard to match the reliability that we get from the grid. And so we all have a benefit in making sure that the grid has the assets that it needs to operate reliably and serve us. And so I think on this question of fast tracking and sort of how can we accommodate the types of resources that we need. First off, we need the RTOs to tell us what's needed to maintain resource adequacy, right? And that comes down to an objective definition of what a resource contributes to the RTO's resource adequacy requirement. And so I think having those objective definitions of sort of how the fast-tracked resource is going to help resolve the identified challenge on that sort of one-off basis, I think that's critical, right? But I think second to that, and this is where the conversation of co-location comes in a little bit, right? From our perspective, again, to the extent, co-location or co-development, is a tool that can help bring on our loads faster, bring on the types of resources that we want to see, but it can be done in partnership with the grid, right, and with grid planners. We think that's another opportunity to help get these resources onto the grid. The other point that I would make is, I hear all the time conversation around sort of the next clean, firm tech, right? Whether it's CCS or whether it's nuclear or whatever. And I will say, part of what has been good about this conversation is that it has forced companies like ours to really sharpen our pencils on what it's going to take from a capital investment perspective to actually contribute to bringing on a resource like that. Now, I fully understand that's not going to solve a problem 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. That's a 10-plus year at best solution. But if we're not planning for that 10-plus year solution now, that just kicks the can down the road. And so I think we're making a lot of progress on that front. And I think, markets as they exist today are going to be well positioned to help bring those resources on when we're ready for that.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, sorry. No, you go ahead.
Thank you. So interesting in the sense that if you kind of look back when we started queue reform, well, first I'd say in terms of dispatchability, I think that does have to be defined, obviously, by the grid operators. And I think we did hear today a little bit that we have a gap in terms of technology if we're trying to do it on with things other than maybe a gas turbine or something like that. So we do have some work there to do that to have resources that are truly dispatchable to meet their needs. But in terms of prioritizing things in the queue, we kind of developed the queue reforms to the queue when with Order 2023 and then all the compliance filing, when our priorities were we've got all these resources trying to attach to the system. They're not getting attached quickly enough. We need to reform the queues. We need to move from first in to first ready. And a lot of folks did that. But what was really interesting coming along the line that gets to the RRI initiative was California kind of made a move in the direction of dealing with this issue while this was going on. They filed with FERC, and FERC approved their integration enhancement process. We were actively involved with that process and liked it in many ways, and we said that to FERC. We had a few issues, but that's been a lot of what's been going on these days. We like a lot of things in principle, but find some things that are troubling from a competitive perspective. But anyway, we're trying. But what they did, if you think about it, was they kind of all of a sudden the way they managed it with a point system, looking at where they need resources, looking at the types of resources they need, they kind of integrated planning into the interconnection process, and that's the way we thought what they were doing. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad. It's a little bit of what PJM just did with RRI. We saw a plan, now we're going to implement it through the interconnection process. But the question becomes, is that a durable approach? So we've got filings coming up on Order 1920 where transmission cost allocation and planning are supposed to occur. How will that relate to all this is an interesting question. I think our feeling has been that whatever we do, it's got to be durable and transparent, which we've heard about all today. And as a market participant, we hope that what PJM did was a one-time thing, but we have a real concern that it won't be, because you're always going to end up with situations where you can't solve a problem at a location, or that process just might not get you there. So we understand why PJM did what they did, but we're a little skeptical that it's a one-time thing, and if it's not, then that to us is a challenge.
Yeah, so I guess what I would add is, look, I think it is a fact that, and our queue, by the way, and I may not have mentioned this, but I think people realize, is that like 95% plus, right, is solar, wind, and some storage. It's a fact that the attributes of those resources, particularly dispatchability, is not the same as what we refer to as our thermal resources that are retiring. That, in my view, doesn't necessarily mean that we should do anything different in the interconnection process. Our focus at PJM, and we've probably not like bragged about it as much as we should, we've put in tremendous automation, software tool improvements. The reason we've made that huge 60% reduction in our backlog is because of a lot of internal improvements. And our goal is to continue to improve our interconnection cycle process. Our transmission owners are important partners, but I would prefer, and that we're not discriminating in the actual interconnection process, right? That we run any resource that is willing to connect to the PJM system through the interconnection cycle, do it as quickly as possible, so that we are not, the interconnection process is not the bottleneck or is not the critical path for generation development. And I think we're headed there. We're not there yet, but I think we're going to get there. The way I would like to handle the difference in generation characteristics, I think, Matt, I think what you were saying is taking a look at our markets. Are there other type of ancillary services that can incent and create the right financial model for us to get that characteristic out of the system, right? So, and it doesn't need to be a fossil fuel resource necessarily. It could be batteries paired with renewable resources to give us that, let's say, dispatchability. But my preference is that we treat that through markets and create the right incentive mechanism, and then enter into the interconnection queue, which I said our goal at PJM is that's no longer the bottleneck, that's no longer the critical path for people's development plans.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the current makeup of the queue being overwhelmingly wind, solar, and batteries. That's true across the country, right? You've got something like 2,600 gigawatts in the queue across the country. Something like 96% of it is wind, solar, and batteries. And so I'm curious how just the role that the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits, some of the policies we've seen out of the Trump administration, some of the executive orders declaring a national energy emergency, unleashing American energy. There's a lot of talk right now about growing out the power grid and why that's so important, and it's coming from both parties. But I'm curious, because when I'm on the Hill, a lot of my focus has been on reconciliation and just what Congress is going to do with the tax credits. So, and I know, Deborah, you've talked a lot about 45X, and that's really important to your members. So can you talk about how, that may not be front of mind for everyone at this moment, but is front of mind for me. So I'm curious how 45X and maybe some of these other credits may factor into, how your members are able to respond to rising demand.
Yeah, well, now that we're fully in tax season,
Yeah.
it's a good time to talk a little bit about IRA. And from our perspective, we hope we don't throw the IRA baby out with the bathwater. There's some good incentives, tax incentives baked in. We've paid a lot of attention to 48C and 45X, advanced manufacturing, advanced energy, because we're firm believers that we need all of the above. And that's going to be required during this time of tremendous demand growth. So, we're trying to go on the offensive a little in the IRA space. We're supporting the Circuit Act, which would expand the 45X tax credit to distribution transformers. There's critical components that are still difficult to source, and we see that being sustained for the coming years. So, we actually think not only should we preserve some of these really important IRA tax credits, but in some cases we should think about expansion. So we're working hard across both parties and both houses of Congress to try to make sure that's protected as we look for tax solutions.
Anybody else want to weigh in on
Yeah.
that and just how that might affect development? And
Yeah, we agreed, and on the Inflation Reduction Act, we saw an uptick in projects right away from particularly overseas. So whether it was the right tax credits or applied to the right thing, it did provide movement. And then I would include like the CHIPS Act, where we're recipient of a big Intel project, and that's we need to reshore semiconductors. They're building some of the AI chips, or at least that's the goal. We have a $7 billion 1,000-acre site under construction, and no clear direction what happens to a lot of that now. The reason it went to Taiwan and offshore to begin with is they have labor advantages. So reshoring it means you're going to probably knowingly increase your costs, and some of these facilities allowed some parity to come back to the United States. So, we did see some movement, and it's sprayed across multiple industries. So just for whatever that's worth, not saying what the right thing to do is from here, but it did create some momentum.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, you're just given the demands that we're seeing out there, you're seeing just a ton of really kind of pent-up capital ready to go and build infrastructure. We're seeing it, our partners are seeing it, and I think right now we need as much certainty as we can get, and I know that is probably asking a lot in this political environment, but one of the quickest ways to derail the development of the infrastructure that we need is to throw in a ton of uncertainty. And I do think, at least in part, the IRA tax credits, regardless of what your view is on them, industry has made significant investments based on those credits' existence, right? And so we're seeing investment, as Dana mentioned already, in projects in districts, right? These are infrastructure projects that are going in the ground. They're putting people at work, and so I think it would be a real risk to upend that. Maybe there's a longer-term question about what the right policy vehicle is to make sure we're investing in the right assets we need as a country, but I don't think pulling the rug out from under the table today is the right approach.
Is Google, maybe some other people on stage, like having conversations with members of Congress right now and conveying your mission? Deborah, you mentioned you were going on offense. What does that look like on the Hill right now?
Yeah, we're having a lot of conversations. Some of our partners that work in the electrical contractor space are having a lot of conversations, as well as high-tech industries about the importance of protecting. Clean energy is in there talking, but even oil and gas, has been investing in some of these technologies that were supported by the tax credit, geothermal, for instance, carbon capture. So. I think there's a broad group of stakeholders that's speaking to members of Congress on this issue, and what I mentioned before, the Circuit Act that's coming out of the Senate, and hopefully there'll be a counterpart in the House to expand that 45X. We've got supporters on both sides there, but there's probably opportunities to do more, to restructure, if needed, restructure these credits in the right way that are going to incentivize the right production as we move into this new era.
And Brian, you mentioned earlier the idea of clean, firm power, and that's become more and more important and more of a buzzword lately. But Google has had a partnership with Fervo, and I'm curious: is that something that could be replicated, scaled up? Or do you envision Google doing more of that type of? You mentioned taking on more of the risk too. So can you talk about the direction things are going from the consumer end and trying to be part of developing more power projects like that?
Yeah, for sure. So we're really proud of our partnership with Fervo, and just for folks who may not know, Fervo is a developer of an enhanced geothermal generation, which is a 24/7 baseload carbon-free generation asset. And we have made an investment in a project in Nevada that will be used to serve, in part, our data centers in Nevada. But we've also structured the investment in a way that the utilities customers can benefit from the reliability of that project at no incremental cost above what the other resource the utility would have invested in. And so I think it is our hope that we can continue to use our capital and position in the market to be able to spur investment in these types of resources. Obviously, it depends on the geography, right? Enhanced geothermal may not be as attractive everywhere, and so maybe in the Southeast or Mid-Atlantic, it is something more like an advanced nuclear asset. The regulatory structure also really matters, right? We had to go through a fairly complicated regulatory process to make that deal come to fruition, right? And we were obviously committed to doing that. But that doesn't always have to be the case. And so if there's an easier pathway, right, for us to go out and directly transact with these third-party suppliers, I think that would be preferred from a resourcing perspective. But at the end of the day, the short answer is yes. And, I do think there's also a workforce component to that. Right, I was talking with the head of Fervo here in DC just a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how the way their drilling technology works, right? It's effectively fracking, right? Mm-hmm. And so they can pull oil rig workers off of oil rigs in North Dakota, have them come out to Utah that same week and jump on the same rigs, right? That's a really good story, and I think as this country is seeing sort of this resurgence in manufacturing, this onshoring, we've heard it mentioned a couple times, right? 2 points, it's not just data centers, right? We are bringing manufacturing jobs back to this country, and that is a very good thing. But the second point is we are providing jobs, right? I hear all the time, data centers are big boxes, you employ a handful of people, and that's it. That's simply not the case. I was at an event in Loudoun County, Virginia. I'm sure you all have heard of it. I certainly have, where we have several data centers, and we were around a table with a bunch of voices from the labor community, and we had carpenters there, we had pipe fitters there, we had this company called Americans there, which if you're not familiar, they supply porta potties to job sites, Americans. But
Gotcha.
What struck me about that meeting is that there was a concrete contractor in the room, and he spoke up and he said, look, your industry has been providing six-figure blue-collar jobs 45 minutes from the nation's capital since 1997. These are not temporary jobs. These are good jobs. These are high-paying jobs. And so I think our connection to the energy industry is that we can continue to do that, right? We can employ the workforce to build the assets that we need to run our businesses. That is a good story, and we should figure out how to make it happen.
Yeah, the geothermal and nuclear both seem to have a lot of bipartisan support on the Hill right now. There's been good signals sent by the new Energy Secretary, Senator Mike Lee, chair of the Energy Committee on the Senate side, supports a lot of geothermal permitting provisions. So it'll be interesting to see. From my perspective, it looks like there's a lot of there's a path to maybe lowering some of the permitting hurdles, at least around geothermal, and encouraging nuclear development over the long term.
I would just say that jobs are bipartisan, right?
Yeah.
And so to the extent we can make that connection, that's going to be politically palatable across a broad audience.
Gotcha. And off top, I wanted to go back to you and this idea of, and by the way, this is a friendly reminder. Please submit your questions if you have them. Be happy to go into audience questions at any point. But the idea of markets sending the right signals to incentivize new generation, I mean, that's a big part of what PJM does. It's a big part of this question. I mean, can you talk a little bit about like the capacity market? The capacity auction got a lot of headlines last summer for the prices that were increasing at that time. Is that, I mean, are the markets sending the right signals today? And what's PJM seen as a response to that price in that auction last year?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly the very high, or I should say relatively high capacity price last summer compared to what it's historically been really created a lot of attention, right, to the capacity market and the mechanisms and rules and details around the capacity market. So we do believe that our capacity market construct is sending the right signal, but we do acknowledge there may be some fine tuning, and we've actually, for our next capacity auction for the 26-27 delivery year, which we hope to run in July this year, we did make file for some adjustments there, and which FERC approved, that we will continue to look at our capacity market to see are there some fine-tuning adjustments that we could do. I know there's been discussions about a sub-annual adjustment in the capacity market. Those are things definitely that we're going to consider. But we do believe that capacity markets, its construct, is fundamentally correct in terms of sending price signals to incent investment. But we do acknowledge there's some adjustments we may have to consider in the construct. I think we've seen some encouraging signs. Like I think Manu in the earlier panel mentioned, we've seen resources that had deactivated to come back. We've seen the 3 Mile Island deal, which I know is kind of a separate deal, but we do believe like capacity prices kind of send a message out there about the value of generation resources. I think it had an impact there. Manu also, I think, mentioned the Homer City coal plant that just got demolished, but now there's plans to bring that back as some pretty significant natural gas development, generation development. And again, we do feel the capacity market is kind of a driver behind these things. And demand response, again, some Manu mentioned, but I think that we have a very mature demand response market, and I think there's a huge opportunity to grow demand response in PJM. So I think that's an opportunity. So fundamentally, yes, I think capacity markets are doing what they need to do, but we will continue to look and refine the markets.
Could I maybe add to that real quick?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think agree with a lot of what Aftab said, but I think it goes back to almost the first point, right, around load forecasting and just the signals that we're sending from our capacity markets or even from transmission planning processes, right? Those are only as strong as the forecast that goes into it. And so I think we as an industry have an obligation to really show up and help our TO partners, our RTO partners, to provide, again, as much confidence into that forecast as we can. And I would, I give PJM a ton of credit because I think back to, almost 3 years ago at this point, we actually sat down with PJM leadership. We had them come down here to DC right as we started seeing this really phenomenon start to happen. And we sat down for 4 hours, right? And we really talked through kind of where are we growing, where are the constraints on the system. And my point is we have been collaborative since then. Like we are constantly engaged with PJM. We are constantly engaged with our utility partners. And so I think that may not always get publicized as much as it should, but we are constantly working together to think about how we can improve the flow of communication from our side to theirs.
I just wanted to offer observation. I'd say not completely on the same page. I mean, I would say that as now that we have generation interests in places that do depend on capacity market revenues, we recognize their importance. We're still not certain, though, that the capacity markets are a long-term solution. It's good that we got a good response and things turning around, but if you look at it in the long term, will they actually deliver the resources we need where they need them? And our concern is that the capacity markets aren't refined enough to provide the attributes of the types of resources you need. We also think that there's a concern that one of the headwinds to development and investment has been regulatory uncertainty. And, you know, a market that relies on going to FERC and get approvals that people fight about all the time doesn't offer a significant amount of regulatory certainty. If you de-emphasize that market and you emphasize a market like the energy market that trades every day and doesn't rely on those types of things as much, that might provide more predictability. So I think that no question that the problem is that we're in a spot where we've maybe turned the ship a little bit, but we don't know if we're going to get it all the way around. And our concern is that if you look at recent history, a market that relies on, you know, the regulatory process and the vagaries of it too much might be difficult. And the other concern we see is affordability is an issue, and the way that market clears creates affordability issues. And we've run into it now with what's going on with Governor Shapiro's complaint and the resolution of that. And that has to be accounted for. And I'm not saying that commenting negatively or positively on that, but these markets are subject to the Federal Power Act, just and reasonable rates. These aren't like you can do whatever you want. And so you have to account for the fact that, you know, maybe that market design is not going to be completely acceptable to consumers. So what else can we do in the market design to address that? Do we do it through the ancillary service markets? Do we have an attribute market that points at certain attributes that we need so they supplement the market to make sure we get the right resources we need? I think those are the types of things we need to think about as we go forward.
We have a markets question from the audience. With increased winter load peaking and more reliance on gas due to thermal retirements, is there any discussion of rewarding the on-site fuel storage attributes of coal generation in the capacity markets?
All right, so let me be clear. I don't run markets at PJM, so I think some of my market comments were stretching my limits. So that one,
Gotcha. All right.
you know, I'm not sure, but Matt, I'll defer to you. So
That's okay. I got no answer for that one either.
Or what's, yeah, I mean, we can move on. There's also somewhat related question about the administration looking at bringing back coal plants or building new coal plants, where to talk about an executive action related to coal. I mean, maybe you can talk generally about just like, what do you see as the role of coal as part of the energy mix? Like, is it something that you see staying, having staying power, or?
yeah, I mean, again, from a PJM perspective, we try to be as much as possible fuel agnostic, right? We're not reliability agnostic, so when we talk about attributes like dispatchability and other characteristics, we're more focused on that, but we try not to get into the fuel type discussion there, but more focused on the kind of attributes that we need, and that's where even as our markets evolve, I think, Matt, what you were suggesting that, you know, the energy ancillary service market is, you know, we get a lot of attention and focus on capacity market, but you know, there's a lot I think we can do in energy ancillary service, and we will do, to try to recognize the attributes that we need. So whether it's coal or not, I think we're probably more looking to state and federal policy impacts on what kind of fuel source would be available.
Gotcha. Anybody else have thoughts on coal? Dana?
I would just say we don't want anything to retire that's baseload and dispatchable. And so we're the first to show up if there's anything we can do to help with that. But we have seen a bunch of retirements over the years, and you know, we hope we've seen the last of them till other solutions avail. But we're all of the above as well.
And I think this is a supply chain question, but even projects that make it through the interconnection queue and get an interconnection service agreement still face network upgrades that can take 3 to 5 years to build. So how do we start to address that part of the problem? And what are some factors that might, bring down that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think network upgrades is always going to be some factor or risk. I think the thing that we try to do as we do the interconnection cycles is in parallel running the regional transmission process. So every time like we just announced a $6 billion investment in 765 kV transmission infrastructure. So those keep rolling into our interconnection base cases and studies. So I think interconnection projects will continue to see the benefits of what we're doing on the regional transmission side. Obviously, the interconnection process is still going to be separate, and developers will be responsible for their impacted network upgrades. But I am hopeful that that will not be the critical issue delaying projects. Even as I look today today we have, let's say, 50 gigawatts of signed interconnection agreements. I know that there probably are some projects impacted by network upgrade delays, but most of what I hear are supply chain issues, financing challenges that are emerging, permitting challenges. So I'm not saying there are no network upgrade impacts. I'm sure there are, but I hear mostly other issues around supply chain permitting and financing challenges for projects that have signed interconnection agreements.
Daniel, if I could, one of the things we did, and if you get a chance to look at House Bill 15 and Senate Bill 2 in Ohio, and it's many in this room actually had a big hand in what about 18 months ago we saw this, declining capacity reserve. We needed base load with a queue that was full of renewables. We're landing new load that needs power. And so we assembled really a business-led cross-functional team, and it included renewable companies, all the folks that run every other nuclear, coal, gas. We had oil and gas producers. We had big end users, tech companies, the data centers and we had many all day. And obviously not everybody's going to agree on everything, but the intent was, what can we agree on? And to, the comments just previously made, a lot of it is to take all the hurdles out of the way. So we've got shot clocks on permits that are very tight. We're taking taxes that were not helpful in attracting investment way down, like in some cases pretty astonishingly, moves. We know that behind the meter generation is something that we need to get better at, and so we've enhanced that. We've double-clicked on supporting markets, and the reason there is, at the end of the day, we want a dollar that's looking to invest in energy to come to Ohio. And so I encourage you to look at it, and EPSA and Todd personally played a big role in that in helping to educate our legislators. And the last thing I'll say is both bills passed in a couple of months, and they were essentially unanimous approvals, and they're quickly going to reconciliation to have the governor sign. And so I'm sure there's some things that could be further enhanced, but I think it's in my 30 years of there, I think it's the most exciting kind of expediter set of rules that I've seen. So at least I think Ohio is doing what it can to meet the needs of the future.
Great. We are pretty much out of time. I just wanted to ask this one more quick question, which is how much of the load growth forecasts are actually coming from data centers and AI versus other growth areas? Do you have any sense of percentages or?
98% of the load growth is data centers.
All right, easy enough. All right, well, join me in thanking the panel.
I'm glad you can take that one. Thank you.